Thanks for tuning into the Dr. Jeff Show. This show is available on Apple, Google, Edify, Spotify, Overdrive, Liftable, and wherever you get your podcasts. Welcome to the Dr. Jeff Show. On this show, I interview major thought leaders from many fields of influence to show how worldview changes everything. I've read several books by today's guest. He is one of the foremost Christian apologists and the head of Reasonable Faith, an organization that seeks to provide an articulate, intelligent voice for biblical Christianity in the public arena. Put on your seatbelts, as they say. We're getting ready to go deep, and it'll be a lot of fun. Please welcome William Lane Craig to the show. Dr. William Lane Craig, welcome to the Dr. Jeff Show.
Thank you. Good to be with you.
I've really been looking forward to this conversation. You're one of my favorite philosophers, one of my favorite Christian apologists. I was first introduced to your work years ago when you did a debate about God's existence at Willow Creek Church in the Chicago area. That video, it's before the internet, but that video went viral in the sense of people ordering VHS cassettes and showing it to their church. It was amazing. So you've been a debater for a long time, being willing to engage in dialogue, conversation with top atheists and people who believe all different kinds of things. But I'd love to have our audience just to get to know you a little bit. How did you come to Christ, and how did you get into Christian apologetics to begin with?
I wasn't raised in a Christian family, Jeff, or even a church-going home, though it was a good and loving home. But when I became a teenager, I began to ask the big questions in life. And to make a long story short, I sat behind a girl in my high school German class who was a radiant Christian and who shared with me the love of God for me. And I had never heard this before, the idea that God could love me. And that sparked something in my soul. I began a 6-month search, reading the New Testament from beginning to end, beginning to pray, to seek God's face. I read Christian books, attended meetings, and at the end of that 6 months, I just yielded my life to Christ and became a Christian. And for me, I had realized during those 6 months that if this were really the truth, I could do nothing less than devote my entire life to spreading this message among mankind. So for me, my Christian conversion was simultaneous with my call to vocational Christian ministry.
And you went from high school, you went into your academic career, and you attended, and even through graduate school, at some of the top secular universities in the world. What was your experience like as a relatively young Christian in the academic setting?
Well, when I went off to Wheaton College, I was only 2 years old in the Lord. And I have to tell you, Wheaton was like heaven on earth to me. Here was a Christian college where professors began in prayer before the class started, where guys in the locker room weren't swearing and telling filthy jokes. It was unreal for me being in that Christian atmosphere. And for 4 years at Wheaton, I learned how to integrate my faith with my education so as to have a Christian perspective on philosophy, on history, on literature, on the arts, and so forth. And it was while I was at Wheaton that the vision captivated me of sharing the gospel in the context of giving an intellectual defense of the Christian world and life view. And that vision then was realized through my further studies in seminary, and then especially my doctoral studies in Europe at the University of Birmingham and at the University of Munich in Germany. And by that time, I was solidly established in my Christian faith, and so did not have difficulty in doing really what I thought was first-rate work at these secular institutions that won the respect of my doctoral advisors.
Bill, how did you get to the place where in giving an intellectual defense of the Christian faith, you decided that you would begin engaging in dialogue and debate with people who believed the
Yeah.
opposite?
Well, I had been in 8 years of high school and intercollegiate debate competition. I had no ability in athletics, but I could compete for my schools on the debate team. And so we traveled all over the country debating other schools. And when I graduated from Wheaton, I thought my debating days were over and done with forever. But what I discovered was that I began to receive invitations from Christian university groups in Canada to debate subjects like humanism versus Christianity or does God exist? And what I discovered was that whereas a few score might come out and hear me give a talk, hundreds or even thousands of students would come out to hear a debate between a prominent opponent of the Christian faith and a proponent of the Christian faith. And so it became very clear to me that evangelism was best conducted in this forum of debate on university campuses.
I would be curious if you have any advice based on your debate experience in high school and the university and debating people.
Uh,
And I appreciate you take seriously people who believe differently. And in your
mhm.
books, you do the same thing. You have a deep level of knowledge of their arguments ahead of time and engagement. But I think a lot of people who are watching and listening right now might be thinking, I'm so glad that he does that. But how can I have better dialogue around the water cooler or at coffee or in the
Yes.
residence hall at night?
Well, I would encourage folks to have a kind of case for the Christian faith that they have memorized and that they can present to someone at the drop of a hat. So, for example, I have 4 or 5 arguments for God's existence that are very simple to memorize. They're only 3 steps or so each. And when someone asks me, why do you believe in God? I can say, well, I can think of at least 3 reasons God exists. And at that point, he's got to say, yeah, like what? And then I roll them out. And if he says, well, that doesn't prove the Christian God, then I'll say, well, I believe that we have good evidence for thinking that God has revealed himself decisively in Jesus of Nazareth. And I'll begin to talk to them about the evidence for the resurrection, specifically for the empty tomb, the postmortem appearances of Jesus, and the transformation in the earliest disciples. And so, if you've got these arguments and evidence under your belt, you're not going to be intimidated by unbelievers. On the contrary, you will really enjoy getting into conversations about these sorts of things. And I predict what you'll find is that the average unbeliever has never thought very deeply about these things. And you will easily be able to carry the day in terms of the argument and evidence you present.
Which gives you a tremendous sense of confidence when
Yes.
you know what you're going to say. And what appears to be spontaneous never is. I remember looking at the transcript of the plan for a political convention once, and it said after the candidate's acceptance speech, there will be a spontaneous 5 minute applause.
Yeah.
There's nothing spontaneous about it. You plan carefully. You think of what you would
Yes.
say, so that when you give an answer for the hope that you have, it's not just off the top of your head or what
Right.
first comes to your mind.
And that's what First Peter 3:15 says we should do. It says always be prepared to do this, which requires preparation in advance.
Yeah. I'd like to turn our attention toward what I think is your most recent book, The Quest for the Historical Atom. And I'd love to dig into it. I know that all kinds of people watch this show, people who have been, their thinking has been framed by old age creationism, theistic evolution, young age creationism. And so there are lots of different viewpoints. And I love the fact that you open the book, The Quest for the Historical Adam, with this quote from Richard Everbeck. No matter what you say or write about the early chapters of Genesis, you are in trouble with a lot of people.
Yeah, that's exactly right, and that's what I'm anticipating. But so far the reactions have been pretty good.
Well, if I could summarize the argument of the book, I would say that you frame it theologically. So there's a theological component to there's a philosophical component, there's an anthropological component to it, there's a paleo-neurological component to it. I mean, in other
Yeah.
words, you had to really know a lot about a lot of different fields of study to bring all of these things to bear on this question of whether Adam really existed.
Yes, it was a real education for me, Jeff. I learned so much about paleoneurology and paleoanthropology and paleogenetics and all the rest of those things. But the order in which you listed those topics, I think, is important. It begins with what the Bible teaches. That's our authority, that's where our bedrock is. And then, having determined what our biblical commitments are as Christians, then and only then do we turn to the question of whether or not this is compatible with the findings of modern science.
Yes, and I know we could spend hours probably talking about this, but I'd like to begin with a question I think is probably on the minds of some of the people who I know are listening and watching to this show, watching the show, is so why is it important
Mm,
theologically that Adam and Eve actually existed as
mhm.
people and not just metaphorically as a
Yeah.
representative of human evolution?
Well, for many Christians, say in the Catholic or Orthodox or Protestant Reformation traditions, who hold to the doctrine of original sin, the historicity of Adam is absolutely crucial because if there was no such person, then the doctrine of original sin is just a fiction. And we can be held neither culpable for Adam's sin nor corrupted by it if there was no such person as Adam. Now, for me, Jeff, that's not a very important consideration because I don't think that the doctrine of original sin, as it's classically understood, is taught in Scripture. I don't think it's there in Genesis 3, the story of the fall, or in Romans 5. But I do think that Paul commits us to the historicity of Adam in that Adam was the floodgate, as it were, through which sin and evil entered the human race and then spread to all people. So it seems to me that we are committed to the historical Adam, not only by Genesis 3, but also by what Paul says in Romans 5. Now, if you then deny that there ever was such a person, this is going to have a major impact upon your doctrine of inspiration and upon the person of Christ. It will affect your doctrine of inspiration because now you've got to say that the Bible teaches falsehoods, that the Bible teaches that there was a historical Adam and there wasn't. And so, how are you going to adjust your doctrine of inspiration so as to allow that? That's a difficult process that I'd rather not go through. The other thing is Christ himself. If Christ is divine, then he must be omniscient. And that means, among other things, that he cannot hold any false beliefs. But I think it's very clear that Jesus believed that Adam and Eve were real historical persons. So if you say that Jesus was wrong in this, that he held false beliefs, how do you preserve his omniscience? And if you can't preserve his omniscience, how do you preserve his deity? So, if we deny the historical Adam, I think this is going to cause major reverberations in our doctrine of Scripture and in our doctrine of Christ.
It's so hugely important from a theological perspective for Christian doctrine, for our understanding of Christ's omniscience. And I know people who are in the sciences are now saying, okay, I get that theologically, But what
Mhm.
I learned in with my biology training was that that's not how history went. Is that really
Yeah.
where the conflict is for most people?
Well, I feel certain that it is. I think that most people think that the first 11 chapters of Genesis, including the stories of Adam and Eve, should be read literalistically, as a straightforward historical narrative. And if that hermeneutical approach to Genesis 1 to 11 is right, that puts Genesis in massive conflict with modern history, linguistics, and science, and therefore occasions a real crisis for the truth and rationality of the Christian faith.
So this really helps set up the case that you're making in the book, which is as you look at theology and philosophy and various sciences to help people understand how the biblical account of Genesis, I don't know if this is the best way to put it, is consonant with
Mhm.
what has been what has been the case for scientific investigation over the last 100 years or so that people have been thinking about this.
Yes, I like that word consonant or compatible. One isn't trying to prove the historicity of Adam and Eve. Rather, one is saying, given the biblical teaching that there were two and only two universal progenitors of the human race on this planet, is that in any way ruled out by the findings of modern science, or is that compatible with what we know of human origins on Earth? And the argument in the book is that that is compatible with what paleoanthropology and the sciences of human origins tell us.
There's a lot to engage with in the book,
Hmm.
and I would say it's written at a level where you this is not your average bedtime reading book. Is that fair to say?
I suppose so. Ben Witherington is a New Testament scholar at Asbury Seminary, and he wrote a review of the book. And he said, I had to laugh when on page 320, Craig says that this is a popular level book. He said, this is not a popular level book. He said, you theology students in particular are going to need to bone up on your science if you're going to understand and appreciate this book. So, it's a book that is written for non-specialists, but I try to explain everything that I deal with so that those of us who are non-specialists can understand it, if we take the time to work through it. So it doesn't bombard the reader with a barrage of technical scientific vocabulary that's unintelligible if you're not a scientist. I try to explain what each of these concepts means, in a straightforward way so that I could understand it, not being a scientist myself.
Yeah, that's really good, and I think that's a fair way to put it. I read some passages aloud to my wife Stephanie as I was going through it, and she said, this is not my book." I said, "But this is my
Oh,
book. I love this. This is, you know, because it's so meticulous, and you
yes.
treat seriously the people who would disagree with your position. You outline their view,
Yeah.
and then you respond to it, very much
Yeah.
like you learned to do in high school debate."
The the section in the book dealing with the origins of the flood story in Genesis 1 to 11 and its relation to earlier flood stories in the Epic of Gilgamesh and the Atrahasis epic, that is extremely meticulous and extremely up to date. By the way, any other author discuss some of these potential parallels in ancient Mesopotamian literature to the flood story. So that would just be one illustration of the care with which I try to handle these difficult questions.
Yeah. Well, let's try to talk about the argument a little bit. Uh, I feel like I just
Mm-hmm.
talked a bunch of people out of reading the book, and I don't. I want to talk
Oh,
them into reading it, but but you've
Okay.
got to take your time through it. It's not the kind of book where you can just sort of
Yeah.
flip through the pages very quickly and absorb the argument. There are a lot of things we need to understand in the world of theology and philosophy. And later in the book, you get into um, uh, mind body dualism and the nature of the
Yeah.
soul and what it means to bear God's image. Those are hugely important things. But let me start more toward the beginning of the book because one of the terms you use the term myth in describing these ancient creation stories and also apply to the book of to the first 11 chapters of Genesis. And when a lot of people hear the word myth, they immediately think of a made up story. How are
Right.
you using that term?
I make it very clear in the book that I'm using the word myth in the sense in which it is used by students of folklore and classical literature to talk about a traditional sacred narrative that is regarded as authoritative in a society that seeks to ground present realities and institutions and values in events in the primordial past. And I think you would agree that Genesis 1 to 11 fits that description to a T. And so I'm not using it in the popular sense where we talk about the myth of the low calorie diet or the myth of the self made man. I recognize that the use of a word like this is potentially misleading, but I believe, Jeff, that as scholars, we need to be straightforward with our people, with our laity, and not try to mince words and use euphemisms as some Old Testament commentators and scholars do. But rather, we ought to be straightforward about what we're saying and then define our terms very carefully so as to preclude misunderstanding. And that's what I try to do. The view that I'm laying out in the book is actually not uncommon among Old Testament scholars, people like Bill Arnold at Asbury Seminary, or John Walton at Wheaton, or Gordon Wenham in his commentary on Genesis, but they just don't use the same terminology. They use euphemisms like proto history or imagistic history, where I try to use the technical terminology that is actually used by students of ancient Assyriology for this kind of literature.
And as you do that, as you make the case, and I loved this part of the book where you arrive at the conclusion that what you read about in Genesis differs significantly from the
Yeah.
other proto myth stories, say the Egyptian or the Babylonian account.
Oh,
And I'd
yeah.
love for you to talk a little bit about that because I just thought that was so significant that biblical
Ah,
history is heading in a completely different direction with completely different
yeah.
purposes.
Thank you for that, Jeff. I'm afraid that my claim that Genesis 1 to 11 is mytho-history will be eclipsed by a much longer discussion in the book that these stories in Genesis 1 to 11 are not based on or derived from myths of ancient Mesopotamia and Egypt. And frankly, as I worked on this subject, I was scandalized by the sloppiness of so many of our Old Testament scholars and commentators in thinking that, just for example, because in Egyptian mythology, darkness, primordial darkness is mentioned, that therefore means that Genesis 1:1 is borrowing from these Egyptian myths. And you've got to do a lot more to show literary dependence than just find parallels plucked out of context. When you look at myths throughout the world, the motif of primordial darkness is everywhere in ancient myths, in the South Sea Island Pacific myths, in South American and North American Indian myths. And yet it would be absurd to say that the author of Genesis 1 borrowed this motif from them. So there's a lot of real sloppiness here that needs to be corrected with respect to the degree to which Genesis 1 to 11 is dependent upon ancient Mesopotamian and Egyptian myths.
What are some of the other things that we learn from the Genesis account about God, the nature of nature, and humanity
Mm.
that we wouldn't pick up from reading some of these other accounts?
Oh, well, one certainly would be the transcendence of the creator God of the universe. The stars and the moon and the sun, the plants and animals, they're not gods. They're just things that God has made. And so, one of the claims I make in the book that I think is very interesting is that what the author of Genesis 1 did was to desacralize nature. He turned nature into a purely natural phenomenon which God transcends. And I credit the author of Genesis rather than the early Greek philosophers with that accomplishment of desacralizing nature. And I argue that in that respect, the worldview of the ancient Hebrew author of Genesis 1 is much closer to modern views of the universe than it is to these polytheistic views of ancient Mesopotamian Egypt, in which all things were full of gods. So that would be one really important difference.
So nature is good, but it's not God.
Right,
And
right.
therefore, a lot of things flow from that. We can study nature because it's objective, it's
Yes.
outside of ourselves, it's knowable, it's not chaotic.
Yes. Oh, absolutely. I get so impatient with these Old Testament scholars who say that Genesis 1:1 teaches that originally there was a primordial chaos out of which God formed an orderly world. That is completely false. The scene you have in Genesis 1:1 and 2 is of an ocean at night with no stars, no moon. It's in darkness, but this is normal water. It has a surface. It has certain properties like liquidity. It has land underneath of it. When the water drains away, that land will appear. That water will one day fall from the skies as rain and water the plants and the animals. This is not a chaos at all. Um, and perhaps one of the best proofs of that is that when the flood occurs with the story of Noah, it returns the earth to this primordial condition. And certainly that was not a chaos in the Greek sense. There was a boat floating on the surface of the waters. There were marine life in the waters, birds in the air above. This is not a chaos in the Greek sense. And so, again, a corrective is in order here to a lot of sloppy statements that Old Testament commentators make in this regard. And let me say one other thing too, Jeff, since you got me on a roll here. You made a very good point about since nature is desacralized, that means that it authorizes us as human beings to exploit nature, to discover its secrets. This is a ratification of the project of modern science, in contrast to this polytheistic world, which is shot through with divination and trying to placate the deities in order to try to get along in the world. One of the most striking differences between Genesis 1 to 11 and these ancient Mesopotamian myths is that the arts and crafts, technology, even things as primitive as the hoe, were given to man by the gods. They were gift of the gods. But in Genesis, it's people who discover herding, agriculture, viticulture, winemaking, metallurgy, music. These are just human creations. Why? Because nature has been desacralized.
Wow. I had not thought about the, the development of technology in quite that way. I think that's a really interesting observation. It, it goes back to the question of how do human beings bear God's image? God is a
Yes.
creator, humans are creative. And
Yes.
it's fascinating to see how so much goes back to Genesis. I
Yeah.
wondered that I know we always have a limited amount of time for discussions like this, and I wish that we didn't because I love this kind of thing. But I'd like to talk a little bit about the, how science. When I grew up and was getting training in biology, there was always a distinction made between humans and our pre-human ancestors. I
Yeah.
remember that term being used frequently. You really bust that idea down in this book, and I'd love for you to explain some of what you found as you studied about Neanderthal man and so forth.
Yes. Well, I think one of the central insights of the book is that we should not identify humanity with Homo sapiens. Homo sapiens is the species to which we belong. But in the past, there were other species of human beings, like Neanderthals. And in the book, I present what I think is just absolutely convincing evidence that Neanderthals exhibited all of the same sort of cognitive human behaviors that Homo sapiens did. And they had a brain case size that was even larger than Homo sapiens. And so, frankly, Jeff, I am just not willing to write Neanderthals out of the human race. I think to do so would be a kind of racism, a sort of dehumanization of these people who were in the image of God just as we are. And what that means then is that if Adam and Eve are the universal progenitors of mankind, they have to be earlier than Neanderthals and Homo sapiens. And the most recent common ancestor for both Neanderthals and Homo sapiens is called Heidelberg man. And so I suggest that Adam and Eve can be plausibly identified as belonging to this species, Homo heidelbergensis, or Heidelberg man.
Mhm. And and this is really significant. What's occurring to me in my mind is we have to remember that the idea of species, as we think of it today, was also a product of scientific writing and thinking and categorization. To
Sure.
then take our categories and impose them backward on history would preclude a lot of people from arriving at the conclusions that you have.
Yeah, it could because typically species don't interbreed, right? But we have decisive evidence that Neanderthals and Homo sapiens did interbreed with each other. They could be man and wife and sire children. And so in our genome today, Jeff, we carry Neanderthal genes. When I first learned this, I was just absolutely astounded that 2 to 3% of my genes are derived from Neanderthals. And in some parts of the world, it's even higher percentage than that. So there was interbreeding among these human beings. They were all human, all part of the same broad human family, but they had some anatomical differences.
I'm trying to think of some of the questions that people might be thinking as they're at this point of the discussion, if they're still with us, that they're dialed in on probably a couple of things. And one is then when did the image of God appear?
I think that a person is not a human being. In a way, that's a misstatement. I think that an organism or a hominin is not a human being unless and until it is in the image of God. And that means it has to have a rational soul in order to be fully human. So, whenever um, the first person created in the image of God, having a rational soul and able to know God, appeared on this planet, that would be the beginning of humanity in the proper sense of the word. And that's why I don't believe that there are other people in history, even in prehistoric times, who were human but not descended from Adam and Eve. In order to be human, you had to be descended from Adam and Eve because they were unique um, as the universal progenitors of all mankind. They were created in the image of God, and it was their children then that carried that image forward.
Can you talk a little bit about the in Genesis 2, uh, when God created man and he became a living soul?
Mm-hmm.
Because when I was taking a psychology class once, and it occurred to me, my professor is studying psychology, the study of the soul, but he does not actually believe in the soul.
Right.
So what are we studying here? And he said, we're studying the self. Can you
Hmm.
talk about the soul a little bit, and sort of the why that's really
Yeah.
significant to
Well,
Christian
I
identity?
don't see body soul dualism exegetically in Genesis 1 or 2. I think you have this uh, very clearly later on in the Old Testament, certainly in the intertestamental period. And then by the time you get to the New Testament, the body soul dualism language is just everywhere. And the fact that Paul can talk about an intermediate state between the death of the body and its resurrection from the dead at Christ's return shows that the soul can and does exist independent of the body. And I think that commits us to body soul dualism. Um, so, in order to be the seat of a rational soul, the body has to have a nervous system and a brain that is sophisticated enough to provide the sort of substratum for thinking and rationality and moral agency and all the rest. So I would imagine that when God formed Adam and Eve, if he didn't do so just de novo out of the dirt, but if he formed them out of pre-existing hominins, there would have to be a sort of biological and spiritual miracle take place that would equip them to be rational beings in God's image.
I'd like for you to talk briefly about language in that sense, because that's another area I've always
Oh,
thought is a real problem for if you have a strictly naturalistic evolutionary mindset. The appearance of language, and that symbolic, phonetic language,
right.
is very difficult to arrive at. But in Genesis 3, the people are talking.
Yeah. It's You're absolutely right that language is a dead certain indicator of humanity. Uh, you can't have language, properly speaking, without human persons. And here I do a study in the book on supposed animal communication systems. Very interesting the way animals alert one another by their cries and so forth. And these are not properly speaking language because the sounds have no reference. See the discussion in the book. Um, so the question is, when does language first appear in the history of the earth? Well, that's very difficult to tell because obviously, until you have writing, how can you tell whether or not they were speaking? So, what you look for would be manifestations of symbolic thought that would be sufficient for language. And here, the presence of cave art is very significant. When you have cave paintings, which represent, via the use of colors and images, things like horses and a pride of lions and a rhinoceros, then you know you've got the sort of symbolic thinking that allows that person to represent those things with words as well as with paint on the wall of the cave. And so part of the book explores when we first see this sort of cave painting going on in the past.
I thought that was fascinating too. And you put the pictures in the book, which was really helpful to me because I had never
Yeah.
thought before that these cave paintings weren't just stick drawings of things. They were animals that we would recognize, and they were animals doing things. There was action,
Yeah.
there was
Yeah.
motion.
And they're gorgeous. When I look at these, I think if you were to ask the average man, draw for me a cartoon of a pride of lions. Can you imagine what it would look like? These stick figures. I mean, it would be horrible. The average person has no artistic ability. And you look at these cave paintings of lions, and they're breathtaking. They are so beautiful. And they're even better, Jeff, than the pictures in the book, because unfortunately, the pictures in the book are only in black and white. Look at those things online in color, and they are dazzling.
Wow. Well, this has been a really fun discussion, and I think if I were to draw a conclusion from it, it's that if you believe in Adam and Eve and you trust Scripture as your authority, you're not crazy from a scientific or
Right.
philosophical standpoint. And whether people agree with the conclusions you arrived at or the way you arrived at them, that's a huge contribution to biblical theology. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Jeff. And thank you for this interview today. It's been so interesting to me because you have asked about things that the average interviewer doesn't raise. And I've really enjoyed talking about those interesting aspects of the book. And there's a lot more in the book for interested persons to check out.
Fantastic. Bill, thank you so much for being on the show today.
Certainly.
A special thank you to my guest today, Dr. William Lane Craig, for his insights on Adam as a historical figure. You're probably going to want to know more. You visit reasonablefaith.org, and on Twitter, you can look at RF Updates. Proverbs 25:2 says, "It is the glory of God to conceal a matter. To search out a matter is the glory of kings." That's what we do at Summit Ministries. We're searching out all of these matters, teaching young adults to ask questions. Scientific inquiry is one of the methods that we use to discern what is true about the world, to discover all of God's goodness. Keep thinking, keep learning, keep growing, and all you have to do is do that for the rest of your life. God's blessings on you. I'll look forward to seeing you next week. Hey everyone, I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Dr. Jeff Show. It's a podcast from Summit Ministries, summit.org. Summit is a nonprofit ministry that exists to equip and support the rising generation to embrace God's truth and champion a biblical worldview. For nearly 60 years, Summit Ministries has been training students and those who work with students to develop, deepen, and defend a biblical worldview through life-changing conferences, thoughtful church, homeschool, and Christian school curriculum books, free online resources, and more. If you want to live out a biblical worldview in today's world, and you desire to instill a lifelong faith in the rising generation, visit summit.org/The Dr. Jeff Show for more information. Listeners, I want you to know that our podcast is on Edify, which is a truly powerful app that brings together thousands of the best Christian podcasts in one place for your listening enjoyment. You can download it at Edify, EDIFI.app. Be sure to share this show if you have enjoyed listening to it. And leave a review, if you would, on the site where you download the show. That helps more people know about the Dr. Jeff Show. And I'll look forward to seeing you next week.